In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world feels distant and heavy with stillness, medieval history often seems like a place of exaggeration, rumor, and imagination. For centuries, scholars believed that many medieval stories were myths invented by monks, travelers, and frightened villagers who misunderstood the world around them. These tales were dismissed as superstition, propaganda, or simple storytelling meant to frighten children or impress kings. Yet time has a way of loosening the earth, uncovering bones, manuscripts, ruins, and forgotten truths. Slowly, patiently, the medieval past began to whisper back. And some of the stories people once laughed at turned out to be far more real than anyone expected. For a long time, historians believed medieval people exaggerated nearly everything. Battles were inflated, miracles invented, monsters imagined. It was assumed that medieval writers lacked discipline and accuracy. They wrote in candlelight, after all, copying texts by hand, often repeating what they heard rather than what they saw. But archaeology does not care about embarrassment or disbelief. It reveals what exists, not what is convenient. And as spades touched soil and libraries opened their locked doors, medieval myths began quietly turning into confirmed facts. One of the most persistent medieval myths involved entire towns disappearing overnight. Old chronicles spoke of villages swallowed by the earth, churches sinking into marshes, and bells ringing beneath the ground. For centuries, historians dismissed these accounts as metaphors for plague, famine, or war. The idea that an entire settlement could simply vanish seemed impossible. But along the coasts of England, the North Sea offered evidence. Beneath the waves, stone walls, roads, and foundations were discovered. The medieval port town of Dunwich, once bustling and wealthy, had been slowly eaten by coastal erosion. Storms, rising tides, and collapsing cliffs erased it piece by piece. Medieval chroniclers were not exaggerating. They were recording something terrifying and very real. The town had not vanished in a single night, but it had truly been lost to the sea. Another medieval myth spoke of endless underground tunnels beneath castles and monasteries. These were said to connect abbeys to taverns, fortresses to forests, and nunneries to nearby villages. For years, scholars laughed at the idea, calling them fantasies born of secret sins and romantic imagination. But when modern renovations began on medieval buildings, hidden passages were found. Some were narrow and damp, others wide enough to move supplies or people unseen. They served as escape routes, storage corridors, and discreet travel paths during sieges or religious unrest. The tunnels were real. Medieval builders had planned for danger, secrecy, and survival far more carefully than modern historians once believed. Medieval people also believed that certain kings carried physical signs of divine favor or punishment. Chroniclers wrote of rulers born with strange marks, unusual proportions, or mysterious illnesses. These accounts were dismissed as political propaganda meant to glorify allies and discredit enemies. Yet medical historians examining remains centuries later found evidence supporting these descriptions. King Richard III of England, long described as deformed and twisted, was discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester. His skeleton showed scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, exactly as medieval sources had claimed. The myth of the crooked king turned out to be anatomical truth. Another long-mocked medieval myth involved animals being put on trial. It was assumed that stories of pigs executed for murder or rats summoned to court were satirical inventions. Surely no legal system could be so absurd. Yet court records across France, Italy, and Switzerland reveal formal trials of animals, complete with lawyers, judges, and sentences. Pigs were hanged, bulls exiled, and insects formally banished from crops. Medieval law treated animals as moral agents when their actions disrupted social order. What seemed ridiculous to modern sensibilities was entirely logical within a worldview that believed God governed all creation equally. For centuries, medieval accounts of strange diseases were dismissed as ignorance. Writers described people sweating blood, collapsing suddenly, or dying within hours. These were assumed to be exaggerations or moral lessons about sin. But medical historians later identified these as early outbreaks of diseases such as tuberculosis, anthrax, and the infamous English sweating sickness. The symptoms recorded matched real illnesses, not imagination. Medieval observers lacked microscopes, but they were careful witnesses. They described what they saw with startling accuracy. Another myth concerned the so-called dancing plagues, where entire towns were said to dance uncontrollably for days or weeks, collapsing from exhaustion or death. For centuries, historians believed these accounts were metaphorical, perhaps describing religious festivals or hysteria. Yet modern researchers believe these episodes were real mass psychogenic illnesses, triggered by stress, famine, and trauma. In some cases, contaminated rye infected with ergot fungus may have caused hallucinations and convulsions. The dancing was not joy. It was suffering made visible. Medieval people believed certain relics healed the sick. Bones of saints, fragments of cloth, and drops of blood were said to cure blindness, paralysis, and madness. While many relics were fraudulent, some sites associated with healing had unusual mineral compositions or water sources rich in antibacterial properties. Certain springs near monasteries showed real medicinal benefits. The myth of healing places was sometimes grounded in chemistry, not magic. There was also the medieval belief that certain women could rule effectively, despite official doctrine claiming otherwise. Chroniclers wrote grudgingly of queens who commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and ruled entire kingdoms. Later historians often minimized their power, calling them regents or exceptions. But charters, letters, and financial records proved otherwise. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda of Tuscany, and Isabella of France wielded genuine authority. Their influence was not mythical, it was documented and undeniable. Medieval travelers spoke of faraway lands with paper money, organized hospitals, street lighting, and advanced sanitation. European scholars dismissed these as exaggerations meant to glorify foreign courts. But contact with the Islamic world and China confirmed these reports. Cities like Baghdad and Cordoba had public libraries, hospitals, and infrastructure centuries ahead of Europe. Medieval travel accounts were not fantasies. They were early journalism. Another myth involved secret medieval libraries, hidden by monks during times of war and religious reform. For years, historians believed most classical knowledge survived by chance. But hidden caches of manuscripts were discovered sealed in walls, buried beneath floors, or hidden in remote monasteries. Monks had intentionally preserved texts, waiting for safer times. The survival of ancient knowledge was not accidental. It was deliberate. Medieval people believed plagues could linger in clothing and objects. This was long mocked as superstition. Yet modern science confirmed that plague bacteria can survive in fabrics for extended periods. Medieval quarantine practices, though imperfect, were sometimes effective. Their instincts, shaped by observation, were closer to truth than later generations assumed. Even the idea that medieval peasants worked fewer days than modern workers was once considered a myth. But tax records and church calendars revealed numerous feast days and seasonal rhythms that limited labor. Life was harsh but not endlessly laborious. The medieval calendar allowed for rest, ritual, and pause. There were myths of mechanical marvels as well. Chronicles described automated doors, moving statues, and self-playing instruments in medieval courts. These were dismissed as fantasy. Yet archaeological finds and surviving diagrams revealed early mechanical engineering, including water-powered clocks and automata. Medieval technology was not stagnant. It was quietly ingenious. Stories of medieval espionage networks were once thought exaggerated. Yet coded letters, invisible inks, and diplomatic spies were very real. Kingdoms maintained intelligence systems long before modern states. The medieval world was watchful and suspicious, not naive. Even the myth that medieval people believed the earth was flat turned out to be false. Educated medieval scholars knew the earth was round, calculating its circumference using ancient texts. The flat earth myth was a later invention, ironically created by modern writers to portray the past as foolish. Slowly, patiently, one myth after another unraveled. The medieval world emerged not as a land of ignorance, but as a place of careful observation filtered through belief, fear, and faith. They misunderstood some things, yes, but they recorded honestly what they experienced. And when we finally listened instead of laughing, we discovered they had been telling the truth far more often than we imagined. As the candlelight flickers lower and the mind drifts toward rest, medieval history becomes quieter, less dramatic, and more human. Not a world of myths and monsters, but of people trying to understand storms, sickness, power, and survival with the tools they had. Their stories were not lies. They were early attempts to make sense of a vast and uncertain world. And now, as sleep settles in, those old voices fade again into silence, resting beneath stone floors, buried libraries, and quiet fields, waiting patiently, as they always have, for someone to listen. The silence that follows those medieval voices is never complete. It lingers, heavy and slow, like dust settling after a long disturbance. And as the night deepens, more of those forgotten truths drift quietly to the surface, one by one, unhurried, unconcerned with whether anyone is awake enough to notice them. There was once a medieval belief that entire armies could vanish without battle. Chroniclers wrote of soldiers marching in the forests or mountains and never returning, leaving behind no bodies, no weapons, no signs of struggle. For generations, historians assumed these were poetic ways of describing desertion or defeat. But archaeology and environmental study suggested another explanation. Certain regions of Europe were riddled with sinkholes, peat bogs, and unstable ground. In places like Ireland and parts of Scandinavia, entire groups could be swallowed by the earth itself. Weapons and armor were later found preserved in bogs, exactly where medieval writers said men had disappeared. The land had taken them, slowly and without spectacle. Medieval myths also spoke of bells that rang by themselves, warning of danger. These stories were dismissed as religious symbolism. But many medieval towns installed early warning systems using wind, vibration, and water pressure. Bells attached to primitive mechanical triggers could ring during storms, floods, or ground movement. What sounded like divine warning was sometimes practical engineering, misunderstood by later generations who forgot how it worked. There was the belief that certain forests were cursed, that travelers who entered them became lost even when paths were clear. Medieval maps often labeled these woods as dangerous, haunted, or deceptive. Modern science suggests that some of these forests contain naturally occurring magnetic anomalies, thick fog patterns, or repetitive landscapes that disoriented travelers. Without compasses or reliable landmarks, people could walk in circles for hours or days. The curse was real, though not supernatural. Medieval monks wrote of strange lights moving across fields at night, hovering above graves or battlefields. These were mocked as ghost stories. Yet modern researchers recognize phenomena such as will-o'-the-wisp, caused by gases released from decaying organic matter. In a world without artificial light, these faint glows would have seemed alive, intentional, and deeply unsettling. The monks were not inventing spirits. They were describing chemistry without knowing its name. Another long-dismissed medieval myth involved sudden collective silence. Chroniclers described moments when entire cities fell quiet at once, birds stopping mid-song, animals refusing to move. These accounts were seen as symbolic pauses before disaster. But seismic studies show that animals often react to earthquakes before humans feel them. Medieval observers noticed these changes and recorded them faithfully. Their silence was a warning, not a metaphor. There were also medieval stories of people surviving burial. Tales spoke of coffins scratched from the inside, of mourners hearing knocks from graves. These were dismissed as horror stories meant to frighten. But medical history confirms that conditions like catalepsy and coma were poorly understood. Premature burial did occur. Some coffins unearthed centuries later showed signs of movement. The fear was justified, and the stories were grounded in tragic reality. Medieval belief held that certain sounds could cure illness. Bells, chanting, and specific musical tones were prescribed for sickness. While mocked as superstition, modern studies show that sound can affect stress levels, breathing, and even pain perception. Medieval healing through sound was crude, but not entirely misguided. Another myth concerned the idea that medieval people measured time differently, feeling days longer or shorter depending on the season. This was thought to be poetic nonsense. But medieval hours were not fixed. Daylight hours were divided into 12 parts, meaning summer hours were longer and winter hours shorter. Time itself changed with the sun. Medieval people experienced days differently, quite literally. There were also stories of medieval communities predicting weather with unsettling accuracy. Farmers supposedly knew when storms would arrive days in advance. Later historians assumed this was luck or exaggeration. Yet observation of animal behavior, cloud movement, wind patterns, and humidity allowed for surprisingly reliable forecasts. Medieval weather knowledge was experiential science. Medieval myths spoke of children born during eclipses carrying unusual traits. These stories were dismissed as astrological nonsense. Yet eclipses caused widespread fear, stress, and disruption. Pregnant women experiencing intense stress could give birth to children with health complications. The cause was misunderstood, but the correlation was observed. There was also the belief that medieval castles were intentionally uncomfortable. Drafty halls, cold stone floors, and narrow windows were thought to reflect poor design. In reality, castles were built to discourage prolonged occupation by enemies. Discomfort was a defensive feature. Medieval builders understood psychology as well as architecture. Chroniclers described medieval kings who never slept properly, waking constantly through the night. This was attributed to guilt or divine punishment. But royal sleeping arrangements involved shared chambers, guards, servants, and constant noise. Sleep deprivation was structural, not spiritual. Even medieval fears of certain colors turned out to have practical roots. Bright green dyes, for example, were toxic, made with arsenic. People who avoided certain colors were protecting themselves without understanding the chemistry behind it. Medieval people believed that plagues followed trade routes and travelers. This was dismissed as xenophobia. But disease does spread along routes of movement. Their suspicion, while often cruelly misdirected, was based on real patterns. As the centuries passed, these myths accumulated like sediment. Each generation added interpretation, doubt, and dismissal. And yet the medieval world remained stubbornly present beneath the surface, waiting for tools capable of understanding it. What makes these stories suitable for sleep is not their drama, but their patience. Truth did not rush. It waited hundreds of years. It allowed itself to be doubted, laughed at, footnoted, and ignored. Then, quietly, it emerged. The medieval mind was not simple. It was cautious, observant, fearful, hopeful, and deeply attentive to its surroundings. Without instruments, they watched. Without data, they remembered. Without certainty, they recorded. And now, as breathing slows and thoughts drift, these old truths return to rest. They sink back into earth and parchment, into bog water and monastery walls. They no longer demand belief. They simply exist, proven, confirmed, and calm. As the night stretches on and the world outside remains unmoving, there are still more of these old medieval truths that drift slowly upward like bubbles rising, through dark water breaking the surface only for a moment before disappearing again. Medieval people believed that memory lived in places. Certain rooms were said to feel heavy, certain roads unsettling, certain fields sorrowful. Chroniclers wrote that battlefields remained restless long after the fighting ended, that churches built over older sites carried moods that could not be shaken. Later scholars dismissed this as emotional projection. Yet modern psychology recognizes how environments absorb human experience. Trauma lingers in landscapes. Even today, people report unease in places where violence once occurred. Medieval people did not have the language for this, but they recognized the feeling and trusted it. There was once a medieval belief that cities could grow sick. Writers described towns becoming tired, diseased, or corrupted, requiring cleansing or abandonment. This was considered symbolic, perhaps moralizing. But archaeology revealed layers of waste, contaminated water systems, overcrowding, and pollution. Cities really did become unhealthy over time. Abandonment was sometimes the only solution. The sickness of cities was not metaphor, it was sanitation. Medieval myths also spoke of voices carried by the wind, messages traveling farther at night. These were dismissed as superstition. Yet sound travels differently in cool air and still conditions. Night air allows voices, bells, and distant noises to carry farther. Medieval watchmen and travelers noticed this. Their world sounded different after sunset, and they paid attention. Another long-ridiculed medieval belief was that certain stones remembered heat. People claimed that walls stayed warm long after fires were extinguished, that stones absorbed warmth from the sun and released it slowly through the night. This was considered poetic nonsense. Yet thermal mass is a real physical property. Stone buildings retain heat. Medieval builders instinctively used this to regulate temperature. Their observation was correct, even if their explanation was incomplete. Medieval people believed that handwriting revealed character. Certain scripts were considered dangerous, others virtuous. While the moral judgment was flawed, modern graphology and neuroscience show that writing style reflects motor control, education, and sometimes neurological conditions. Medieval scribes were not entirely wrong in noticing patterns between hand and mind. There were stories of medieval mirrors being dangerous, capable of stealing souls or altering behavior. These were dismissed as fear of reflection. But mirrors were rare, expensive, and unfamiliar. Seeing oneself clearly was unsettling in a culture without constant self-images. The psychological impact of self-recognition was profound. Mirrors changed how people understood identity, and medieval discomfort reflected that shift. Medieval myths also warned against sleeping in certain directions, claiming it caused nightmares or illness. This was mocked as superstition. Yet airflow, light exposure, and proximity to damp walls all affected sleep quality. Certain orientations genuinely led to discomfort or sickness. The reasoning was mystical, but the result was practical. There was a belief that medieval bells could crack glass, harm crops, or calm storms. While exaggerated, sound vibrations do affect materials and living beings. Bells also regulated community behavior, signaling time, danger, and safety. Their influence was psychological and physical. Medieval people understood their power instinctively. Medieval writers described moments when time felt suspended during crises, when hours stretched unbearably long or passed without notice. This was dismissed as literary flourish. Yet modern neuroscience confirms that stress alters time perception. Medieval chroniclers were recording subjective experience with remarkable honesty. Another myth involved medieval hospitals being places of death rather than healing. This was partially true. But recent research shows that some medieval hospitals provided rest, nutrition, cleanliness, and isolation, which improved survival rates. Healing was limited, but care existed. The myth of complete neglect was overstated. Medieval people believed that certain smells caused illness. This theory, known as miasma, was incorrect in its explanation but useful in practice. Avoiding foul smells often meant avoiding waste and decay, reducing disease exposure. Their noses guided them when science could not. There were medieval myths about handwriting fading faster on certain parchments, about ink bleeding or surviving fire. These observations were accurate. Different inks and materials aged differently. Medieval scribes learned this through experience and adjusted their work accordingly. Medieval people believed that night carried different dangers than day, not just because of crime or animals, but because the body itself changed. They noticed deeper sleep, vivid dreams, and slower reactions. Modern chronobiology confirms that circadian rhythms alter perception and behavior after dark. The medieval night was biologically different. Even the idea that medieval people feared silence was dismissed as poetic exaggeration. But silence in a pre-industrial world was rare and often signaled danger. No animals, no wind, no sound meant something was wrong. Silence was information. As these truths pile gently upon one another, they do not demand excitement. They do not ask for surprise. They simply settle, like snow falling endlessly in a quiet field. The medieval world was built on attention. People listened because they had little else to distract them. They watched clouds, animals, shadows, and seasons. They remembered patterns because memory was survival. When something felt wrong, they noticed. When something repeated, they recorded it. Modern knowledge did not replace medieval observation. It explained it. And now, as the mind grows heavier and the need for understanding loosens its grip, these old beliefs no longer need defending. They no longer need proof. They can rest as what they were always meant to be. Careful notes taken by tired people trying to live another day. The candles burn low again. The bells are silent. The myths, proven and unproven alike, drift back into the long sleep of history. The quiet does not end there. It never truly ends. It only deepens, becoming softer, slower, more accepting of everything that remains unfinished. And in that softened space, a few more medieval understandings drift forward. Not urgently, not brightly, but with the same steady calm that carried them through centuries. Medieval people believed that repetition mattered. Doing the same thing at the same time each day was thought to keep the world in balance. Prayers repeated, meals taken at fixed hours, bells rung in predictable patterns. Later thinkers mocked this as obsessive ritual. Yet modern psychology recognizes the calming power of routine. Repetition stabilizes the mind. It reduces uncertainty. Medieval life, though harsh, was structured to protect mental endurance. Their rituals were not empty. They were anchors. There was also a medieval belief that names carried weight. People avoided speaking certain names aloud, fearing misfortune. This was dismissed as magical thinking, but names shape attention. To name something is to focus on it, to give it presence. Medieval caution around language reflected an intuitive understanding that words influence thought and behavior. Silence, sometimes, was protection. Medieval myths spoke of roads that tired travelers more than others, even when distances were equal. These roads were said to drain strength or will. Historians once laughed at this idea. But terrain, incline, surface texture, and exposure to wind or sun all affect fatigue. Medieval travelers walked constantly. They noticed which roads exhausted them. Their judgments were bodily, not imaginary. There was a belief that certain foods made people sad, angry, or sluggish. Medieval medicine linked temperament to diet, calling it imbalance. While the theory of humors was flawed, modern nutrition confirms that food affects mood and energy. Medieval observations were based on lived experience, repeated thousands of times. Medieval writers described the sensation of being watched in empty spaces, especially churches at night. This was labeled superstition. But architecture, acoustics, echo, and shadow all influence perception. Large stone spaces amplify small sounds and distort light. The feeling of presence was not madness, it was the body responding to environment. There was once a medieval belief that sleep before midnight was deeper than sleep after. This idea was dismissed as folklore. Yet circadian biology suggests that early sleep aligns better with natural hormonal cycles. Medieval nights, unlit by electricity, followed the rhythm of darkness. Their sleep patterns matched the body more closely than ours. Medieval myths also spoke of laughter being dangerous at certain times, particularly during illness or mourning. This was seen as emotional repression. But laughter affects breathing, heart rate, and energy expenditure. Medieval caution was not about joy, but timing. They observed when the body could afford release and when it could not. There were stories of medieval sailors smelling land before seeing it. This was long doubted. But vegetation, soil, and human activity produced distinct scents carried by wind. Sailors learned to trust their senses. Smell guided them as much as stars. Medieval people believed that animals sensed death before humans did. Cats leaving houses, birds going silent, dogs behaving strangely, these accounts were mocked. Yet animals detect changes in smell, sound, and behavior. Medieval people lived close enough to animals to notice these patterns. Their conclusions were not precise, but their observations were real. Even the medieval fear of certain numbers, days, or dates had roots in experience. Some days truly were more dangerous due to market schedules, travel patterns, or seasonal risks. The superstition grew from repeated coincidence, remembered and reinforced. Medieval myths spoke of fatigue settling into bones during winter, of cold not just chilling skin but slowing thought. Modern science confirms seasonal affective changes, vitamin deficiencies, and reduced activity affecting mood and cognition. Medieval people felt winter deeply. They wrote about it honestly. There was a belief that writing things down gave them permanence, that words on parchment could outlive memory itself. This was not superstition, it was correct. Writing extended human thought beyond the body. Medieval scribes understood this power, even if they framed it spiritually. Medieval people believed that forgotten places became dangerous. Abandoned roads, unused wells, neglected buildings. This was dismissed as fear of decay. But neglect leads to collapse, contamination, and unpredictability. Avoidance was sensible. They believed that constant noise unsettled the soul. In a quiet world, noise meant threat. Modern research confirms that chronic noise increases stress. Medieval people protected silence because it protected them. As these thoughts continue to drift, they no longer form arguments. They do not try to persuade. They simply exist, as the medieval world itself existed, one observation at a time, layered gently upon the last. History does not rush toward truth. It circles it, rests near it, forgets it, and then slowly returns. The medieval people were not waiting to be corrected by the future. They were living inside their present, paying attention, doing their best to understand a world that was vast, dark, and often unforgiving. And now, as the mind grows heavier and the body sinks deeper into stillness, these old understandings no longer need to be separated into myth or fact. They soften into something else entirely: experience, memory, quiet knowledge. The night continues to hold its shape, unchanging and patient. And within that stillness there remain a few more traces of medieval understanding, drifting softly like embers that never quite go out. Medieval people believed that fatigue could be shared. Chroniclers wrote of entire households growing tired together, of villages that seemed to move more slowly after long winters or difficult years. This was dismissed as poetic exaggeration. Yet modern psychology recognizes emotional and physical contagion. Stress, exhaustion, and despair spread through communities. Medieval observers noticed this collective weariness and gave it meaning in the only way they could. There was a medieval belief that certain stories should only be told at specific times. Night stories were different from day stories. Some were meant to be spoken only in low light when the mind was already drifting. This was seen as superstition or censorship. But cognitive science shows that the brain processes information differently when tired. Medieval storytellers adjusted their content to the state of their listeners. They understood attention without naming it. Medieval myths spoke of old buildings breathing, of walls that sighed in the evening and floors that groaned before dawn. These descriptions were mocked as imagination. Yet wood expands and contracts, stone shifts with temperature, and medieval structures were alive with sound. In a quiet world, these noises were unmistakable. Buildings did not breathe, but they spoke. There was a belief that writing at night produced different thoughts than writing during the day. Scribes noted changes in tone, mood, and clarity, depending on the hour. Later scholars dismissed this as romantic nonsense. But fatigue, lighting, and isolation alter cognition. Medieval scribes noticed these shifts because writing was slow, deliberate, and physically demanding. Medieval people believed that looking at the same horizon every day shaped the mind. Farmers, shepherds, and guards developed a deep familiarity with landscapes. When something changed, they noticed immediately. This was dismissed as anecdotal. Yet modern studies show that spatial familiarity sharpens perception. Medieval vigilance was trained, not accidental. There were myths about medieval bridges, choosing who could cross them. Bridges were said to collapse under certain people but not others. This was explained as divine judgment. In reality, weight distribution, pace, and timing affected structural stress. Medieval people observed patterns without engineering formulas. Their conclusions were emotional, but the danger was real. Medieval belief held that certain illnesses ended suddenly after confession or forgiveness. This was attributed to miracles. But stress, guilt, and anxiety affect immune response. Relief can trigger real physical improvement. Medieval healing was sometimes psychological before anyone understood the term. There were stories of medieval clocks lying, of timepieces running fast or slow depending on the weather. This was dismissed as mechanical failure. But early clocks were sensitive to temperature and humidity. Medieval time truly did change with the air. Medieval people believed that hunger sharpened senses. While starvation was feared, mild hunger was thought to bring clarity. Modern research confirms heightened alertness during short-term hunger. Medieval fasting practices were extreme, but their observations were accurate. There was also a medieval understanding that solitude could either heal or destroy, depending on its length. Hermits warned against isolation without structure. This was spiritual advice, but modern psychology confirms the danger of prolonged loneliness. Medieval caution was wisdom disguised as theology. Medieval myths spoke of roads remembering footsteps, of paths becoming easier to walk the more they were used. This was dismissed as metaphor, but repeated travel compacts soil, clears obstacles, and creates familiarity. Roads did remember, in their own way. They believed that grief made the body heavier, that mourners moved more slowly and tired easily. This was seen as emotional language, yet grief affects muscle tone, posture, and energy. Medieval writers described physical sorrow accurately. Medieval people thought that being seen mattered, that people who disappeared from community life weakened and faded. This belief shaped village routines. Modern social science confirms the importance of social visibility. Medieval communities survived by keeping people present. There were myths of medieval children sensing danger adults ignored. This was dismissed as fantasy. But children often notice environmental changes adults overlook. Medieval families lived close enough to observe this repeatedly. Medieval belief held that certain mistakes repeated themselves until corrected, that unresolved actions returned in different forms. This was framed as moral consequence. Modern behavioral science calls it pattern reinforcement. Medieval language was symbolic, but the pattern was real. As these remaining thoughts drift slowly downward, they do not accumulate tension. They release it. They soften the mind rather than stimulate it. This is why medieval history, when stripped of drama, becomes ideal for rest. It moves at human speed. It pauses, it repeats, it accepts uncertainty. The medieval world did not demand constant explanation. It allowed questions to remain unanswered. It allowed beliefs to coexist with doubt. It did not rush toward clarity. And now, as breathing evens out and awareness loosens its grip, these final remnants settle alongside the others. They do not stand apart as myths proven true or false. They rest together, equally quiet. The past does not argue with sleep, it understands it. And so the night continues, unchanged, unremarkable, deeply calm, holding centuries of observation without asking anything in return, while sleep, steady and inevitable, finishes what history began. The stillness remains unbroken, and it no longer feels necessary to separate one thought from the next. They arrive slowly now, almost weightless, as if the medieval past itself has grown tired of speaking, and is content simply to exist nearby. Medieval people believed that attention could wear out. They warned against staring too long at fires, water, or the open sky, claiming it made the mind drift and the body weak. This was dismissed as fear of distraction. Yet prolonged focus without movement does induce trance-like states. Medieval caution came from noticing how easily the mind slipped away when the body stayed still. There was a belief that certain tools absorbed the habits of their users. A well-used knife was said to cut differently, a familiar plow to move more smoothly. This was not magic. Wear patterns, muscle memory, and familiarity shaped how tools behaved. Medieval craftspeople understood this relationship deeply, even if they described it poetically. Medieval myths spoke of footsteps echoing longer in certain corridors, of sound lingering where many voices had passed. This was dismissed as imagination. But acoustics vary with shape, material, and usage. Medieval builders learned through listening. Sound guided design long before measurements did. There was also the medieval belief that thought slowed in darkness. People avoided making important decisions at night. This was framed as spiritual caution. Modern research shows cognitive fatigue increases after sunset. Medieval restraint was practical wisdom. Medieval people believed that illness made time feel uneven, that days blurred or stretched endlessly during sickness. Chroniclers described long nights and short mornings. This was dismissed as literary mood. Yet pain and fever distort perception of time. Medieval patients experienced exactly what was written. There were myths about certain chairs being unlucky, certain beds restless. These were blamed on spirits. But drafts, uneven floors, and poor support affected comfort and sleep. Medieval households noticed patterns and responded with belief. Medieval people thought that fatigue settled into joints before muscles, that cold reached bones first. Modern medicine confirms joint sensitivity to temperature and pressure. Their language was metaphorical, but their sensation was real. There was a belief that looking after animals improved human health. Farmers claimed caring for livestock kept them grounded. This was dismissed as sentimental. Yet companionship, routine, and physical activity improved mental health. Medieval life made this connection naturally. Medieval myths spoke of long journeys changing people permanently. Travelers returned quieter, more patient, less reactive. This was attributed to spiritual growth. Modern psychology recognizes the impact of prolonged exposure to uncertainty and movement. Medieval travel reshaped the mind. They believed that listening required effort, that silence was not passive but active. Monks trained themselves to hear faint sounds, distant bells, subtle shifts. This discipline sharpened awareness. Medieval silence was full, not empty. There was a belief that writing calmed restless thoughts. Scribes noted steadier breathing and slower heartbeats while copying texts. This was considered devotion. But repetitive hand movement and focus reduced anxiety. Medieval writing was meditation before the word existed. Medieval people believed that fatigue made memories surface unexpectedly, that old thoughts returned when the body was tired. This was attributed to spiritual reflection. Modern neuroscience confirms that the tired brain loosens control, allowing memory to wander. There were myths that medieval roads felt longer in heat and shorter in cold. This was dismissed as imagination. Yet physical strain, dehydration, and sensory overload alter perception of distance. Medieval travelers measured with bodies, not maps. Medieval belief held that grief arrived in waves, not all at once. Chroniclers described sorrow returning suddenly after quiet days. This was dismissed as melodrama, but grief is non-linear. Medieval descriptions were accurate. They believed that some fears faded only when ignored long enough. This was framed as faith overcoming doubt. Modern psychology recognizes exposure and habituation. Medieval language was spiritual, but the process was real. Medieval people thought that patience could be trained like a muscle. Long waits, repeated tasks, and delayed rewards were seen as strengthening character. This was moral teaching, but also neurological conditioning. Medieval life demanded patience and people adapted. As these final thoughts settle, they do not form conclusions. They do not point toward lessons. They simply exist as the residue of long observation accumulated quietly across centuries. The medieval world was not rushing toward modern understanding. It was learning how to endure, how to notice without panic, how to rest when nothing could be changed. And now, there is nothing left to add. The mind no longer needs another example, another explanation, another gentle proof. Everything that needed to be said has already been said, slowly, repeatedly, and without urgency. The night remains still, the past remains quiet, and sleep, steady and unquestioning, completes the circle. There is no ending here. Only rest. The quiet accepts this continuation without resistance, as if it expected nothing else. There is no need to hurry, no need to arrive anywhere. The medieval past has always been patient, and it continues in that same manner now. Medieval people believed that some knowledge arrived only when the body was tired enough to stop resisting it. They noticed that insight often came late at night or after long labor, when the mind loosened its grip on certainty. This was framed as divine whispering. Modern understanding calls it reduced cognitive filtering. The experience was the same. Fatigue opened doors that effort kept closed. There was a medieval belief that walking calmed troubled thoughts more effectively than sitting still. Monks paced cloisters. Farmers walked fields even when there was no work to be done. This was not restlessness. Movement regulated thought. Medieval life included walking as medicine long before anyone named it as such. Medieval myths spoke of rain feeling different depending on mood, of storms that exhausted some people and refreshed others. This was dismissed as imagination. Yet weather affects pressure, light, sound, and emotion. Medieval observers lived without barriers between themselves and the sky. They felt every change directly. They believed that unfinished tasks weighed on sleep, that the mind returned to neglected duties during the night. This was considered moral anxiety. Modern psychology recognizes the Zeigarnik effect. Medieval experience noticed what science later described. There was a belief that certain songs should not be sung alone, while others were meant only for solitary voices. This was seen as tradition without logic. Yet group singing synchronizes breathing and heart rate, while solo singing regulates emotion. Medieval music followed bodily wisdom. Medieval people thought that holding tools incorrectly led not just to injury, but to impatience and frustration. This was framed as respect for labor. Ergonomics now confirms posture affects mood. Medieval craft knowledge was intimate and embodied. There were myths of medieval travelers sensing home long before seeing it. They spoke of familiar smells, sounds, and air. This was dismissed as nostalgia. But the body recognizes patterns deeply. Home announces itself quietly, before the mind catches up. They believed that excessive speed was dangerous, that rushing unsettled both body and judgment. Medieval warnings against haste were moralized, but practical. Rapid movement increased mistakes, injuries, and conflict. Slowness was survival. Medieval people believed that repeated failure dulled fear. A task failed often enough lost its threat. This was framed as humility. Modern psychology calls it desensitization. Medieval endurance reshaped emotional response. There were beliefs about eyes tiring before the mind, about sight growing unreliable with fatigue. Scribes rested their eyes frequently. This was not superstition. Visual strain was real, especially by candlelight. Medieval work respected limits. They believed that shared silence strengthened bonds more than constant speech. Long meals eaten quietly, long walks without conversation. This was spiritual discipline. Social science now confirms shared silence builds trust. Medieval community understood this instinctively. Medieval myths spoke of patience being audible, of calm voices sounding different from hurried ones. This was poetic but accurate. Tone, rhythm, and pace reflect emotional state. Medieval listeners were attentive to these cues. They believed that weathered faces held memory, that age stored experience visibly. This was dismissed as symbolism. But expression lines, posture, and gaze reflect lived history. Medieval reading of faces was observational, not mystical. Medieval people believed that some worries solved themselves if left untouched long enough. This was framed as faith. But time alters circumstances. Medieval restraint prevented unnecessary action. Waiting was sometimes the wisest choice. There were myths that medieval paths grew quieter at night, not only because people slept, but because the land itself rested. This was poetic language. Yet reduced activity changed soundscapes completely. Night transformed perception. They believed that early mornings belonged to reflection, not action. Important work waited until the day fully arrived. Circadian rhythms support this. Medieval schedules matched the body. Medieval people believed that certain memories returned only in darkness, that daylight pushed them away. This was attributed to dreams and spirits. Neuroscience confirms memory retrieval changes with fatigue and light. Medieval nights carried memory gently. And now, even these thoughts begin to thin. They stretch out, spaced farther apart, as if the mind itself is slowing its pace to match the breathing of the body. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to clarify. The medieval world does not demand recognition. It settles comfortably into the background, like a familiar sound that fades without vanishing. History becomes texture instead of narrative. Observation becomes atmosphere, thought becomes rhythm. The night continues doing what it has always done. And sleep, unremarkable and reliable, arrives not as an event, but as a gradual easing, a soft lowering of awareness. The continuation comes so gently that it almost feels unnecessary, yet it happens anyway, the way breathing continues even when no one is counting it. Medieval people believed that endings were rarely sudden. They thought most things faded rather than stopped. A day did not end, it thinned into night. A life did not vanish. It loosened its hold. This belief was not dramatic, it was practical. They watched fires burn down to embers, watched seasons slide into one another without clear borders. They understood transition as a quiet process. There was a medieval understanding that thinking itself could become heavy, like wet clothing after rain. When thoughts felt slow and difficult, people were encouraged to stop forcing them. This was framed as humility before God, but it was also an understanding of mental fatigue. Medieval rest included resting the mind, not just the body. Medieval myths spoke of comfort in familiar discomfort. A hard bench, a cold floor, a repeated ache. People trusted what they knew, even when it was unpleasant. This was dismissed as lack of choice. But familiarity reduces anxiety. Medieval stability often came from predictable hardship, rather than uncertain ease. They believed that the body learned patience before the mind did. Long hours of waiting trained muscles to be still, breath to slow. Thought followed later. Modern relaxation techniques reverse this, but medieval life achieved the same effect naturally. There was a belief that certain worries grew quieter if spoken aloud once and never repeated. Confession served this role. Speaking released pressure. Modern psychology confirms the relief of verbalizing stress. Medieval practice understood this intuitively. Medieval people thought that dawn was not meant for judgment. Important decisions were delayed until the day warmed. Early hours were for observation only. This was not laziness. Cognitive clarity improves after full waking. Medieval timing respected mental readiness. There were myths of medieval cloisters designed to slow walking, corners, narrow paths, repetitive arches. This was seen as symbolic, but architecture shapes movement and pace. Medieval spaces guided the body toward calm without instruction. They believed that tired hands made honest work. A task completed slowly, with effort, was considered truer than one rushed. This belief shaped craft, farming, and writing. Modern studies link slower pace with reduced error. Medieval labor honored this rhythm. Medieval people believed that listening late at night revealed truths hidden during the day. Fewer distractions, fewer voices, this was framed as spiritual clarity. But reduced sensory input sharpens perception. Medieval night listening was practical awareness. They believed that some thoughts were seasonal, returning each year at the same time. Grief in winter, restlessness in spring, this was attributed to memory and ritual. Biology supports seasonal emotional patterns. Medieval calendars reflected this understanding. There were beliefs that laughter sounded different indoors than outdoors, that joy behaved differently in enclosed spaces. This was noticed, not theorized. Acoustics and social context changed emotional expression. Medieval observation was precise. Medieval myths spoke of the body learning paths even when the mind forgot them. Muscle memory guided movement in darkness. This was not magic. Repetition trained the body. Medieval knights relied on this deeply. They believed that fatigue softened judgment, making people kinder or quieter. Sometimes this was true. Exhaustion lowered defenses. Medieval evenings were gentler because bodies were tired enough to stop resisting one another. Medieval people thought that too much clarity was dangerous, that some uncertainty protected the mind. This was framed as humility. Modern psychology recognizes the stress of constant certainty seeking. Medieval acceptance reduced mental strain. They believed that the sound of breathing mattered, that calm breath calmed others nearby. Communal sleeping spaces made this noticeable. Modern studies confirm breathing synchronizes groups. Medieval rest was collective. There were myths of medieval roads sounding hollow before collapse. Travelers listened for changes beneath their feet. This was not superstition. Wood, stone, and soil give warnings. Medieval survival depended on listening. They believed that tired eyes saw less but noticed more. Details softened, patterns emerged. Artists and scribes worked differently at night. Fatigue changed perception. Medieval creativity followed these shifts. Medieval people believed that being awake too long blurred the boundary between thought and memory. This was attributed to visions. Neuroscience confirms this overlap. Medieval descriptions were accurate experiences without explanation. As these final remnants drift even more slowly now, they no longer feel like additions. They feel like echoes, repetitions of something already understood. The medieval world does not close a door. It lets it remain slightly open, enough for air to pass, enough for silence to move gently through. Nothing insists on being remembered. Nothing demands an ending. The night continues holding everything evenly, myths, truths, observations, misunderstandings, all resting together without conflict. And sleep, patient and unremarkable, settles deeper still, until even the need to continue becomes unnecessary. Medieval people believed that some moments were meant to stretch. Waiting for bread to rise, for water to boil, for daylight to return. These pauses were not filled with activity. They were simply endured. Later generations called this inefficiency. But medieval life understood waiting as part of living, not an interruption to it. Waiting slowed the mind until it matched the pace of the world. There was a medieval belief that tiredness revealed truth. When energy was gone, pretense faded. Chroniclers wrote that people spoke more honestly late in the day. This was framed as humility. Modern psychology recognizes reduced inhibition during fatigue. Medieval evenings were quieter, but more sincere. Medieval myths spoke of thoughts settling like sediment in water. If the mind was left alone long enough, clarity appeared at the bottom. This was not explained, only trusted. Meditation would come later. Medieval stillness achieved the same result by accident and necessity. They believed that repeated sounds lost their sharpness. Church bells rang daily not just to mark time but to soften fear. Familiar noise became background. Medieval people used repetition to tame anxiety without naming it. There was a belief that places remembered care. A well-tended field felt different from a neglected one. This was dismissed as sentimentality. But soil health, structure, and yield respond to long-term treatment. Medieval farmers sensed this through touch and effort. Medieval people thought that some worries were too large for thought and had to be carried physically instead. Long walks, heavy labor, slow breathing. This was framed as penance. But movement processes emotion. Medieval bodies did what language could not. They believed that night air felt heavier because it was closer to earth. This was not scientifically true, but the sensation was real. Cooler temperatures, stillness, and quiet made the air feel dense. Medieval language captured experience, not measurement. There were myths that medieval fires burned differently at night, that flames moved more slowly. This was dismissed as imagination, but perception changes in darkness. The fire became the only movement left. Medieval knights taught patience through watching flame and ember. Medieval people believed that hands remembered prayers even when the mind wandered. Repetition trained the body. Rosaries, beads, weaving, carving. The hands carried rhythm when thought grew tired. Modern science calls this procedural memory. Medieval devotion lived in muscle. They believed that being alone was safest when it was chosen and most dangerous when it was forced. Hermits chose solitude. Prisoners endured it. This distinction was not philosophical, it was experiential. Medieval warnings were accurate. Medieval myths spoke of old paths feeling narrower over time. This was blamed on age or spirits. In truth, erosion, vegetation, and changing use altered them. Medieval walkers noticed these slow transformations because they returned again and again. They believed that sorrow made sounds duller and colors dimmer. Chroniclers described the world flattening after loss. This was dismissed as metaphor, but depression alters sensory processing. Medieval descriptions were lived reality. Medieval people believed that certain silences healed more than words. Sitting together without speaking, especially after hardship. This was ritualized in monasteries. Modern therapy recognizes the power of shared quiet. Medieval practice arrived there first. They believed that fatigue made the body heavier but the mind lighter. When strength was gone, resistance faded. Acceptance followed. Medieval endurance was not heroic. It was adaptive. There were myths that medieval children slept deeper than adults because they had less memory. This was not entirely wrong. Stress and memory affect sleep quality. Medieval observation was simple but careful. They believed that a task begun slowly ended more smoothly. Haste created rough endings. Medieval work rhythms reflected this belief. Craft survived because it respected pace. Medieval people thought that some truths were only visible from the corner of the eye. Direct focus made them disappear. This was not mystical. Peripheral awareness notices patterns missed by concentration. Medieval watching was soft, not fixed. As these thoughts continue to drift, they become less distinct. They blur together, like footprints filling with snow. Nothing stands apart long enough to require attention. The medieval world no longer feels distant. It feels quiet and nearby, like a low sound that has always been present and only now fades into the background. There is no conclusion waiting ahead. No final idea approaching. Only the slow, steady continuation of stillness where history, myth, and truth lie side by side, undisturbed. And sleep, unhurried and reliable, moves in the same way medieval time once did, not by sudden change, but by gentle, almost unnoticeable drift. Medieval people believed that tired minds noticed patterns better than sharp ones. When alertness softened, repetition stood out. They recognized routines not by analysis but by familiarity. This was dismissed as dullness. Yet pattern recognition often improves when the mind stops forcing focus. Medieval attention was gentle, not aggressive. There was a belief that habits shaped the body long before they shaped thought. A repeated posture, a daily movement, a familiar task. Medieval life was built on repetition. Bodies learned first. Minds followed slowly behind. Modern neuroscience agrees that behavior rewires before belief. Medieval myths spoke of quiet mornings feeling heavier than loud afternoons. The stillness carried weight. This was not fear. It was sensitivity. Soundlessness magnified awareness. Medieval dawn was thick with presence. They believed that some aches belonged to seasons rather than injuries. Cold brought stiffness. Damp brought pain. This was dismissed as exaggeration. But joints respond to weather changes. Medieval bodies were barometers. Medieval people thought that watching animals rest taught humans how to stop. Cats sleeping in sun, horses standing quietly, birds settling without urgency. This was not symbolism. It was observation. Animals did not rush. Medieval people learned stillness from them. There was a belief that exhaustion stripped life down to essentials. Hunger, warmth, rest. Everything else faded. Medieval hardship simplified existence. Modern minimalism seeks what medieval life enforced. They believed that certain words lost meaning if repeated too often. Prayer was spaced, not constant. Language required rest. Linguistics confirms semantic saturation. Medieval restraint preserved significance. Medieval myths spoke of fog carrying memory. Fields looked different after mist. Paths felt unfamiliar. This was dismissed as atmosphere. But reduced visibility alters spatial perception. Medieval travelers adapted by slowing. They believed that slowing prevented mistakes more reliably than caution. Moving gently gave time for correction. Medieval labor reflected this wisdom. Care came from pace, not fear. Medieval people believed that fatigue softened pride. Tired bodies stopped defending identity. Cooperation increased. Evening communities were quieter and kinder because energy for conflict was gone. There was a belief that every task had a natural rhythm. and working against it caused strain. Milling grain, turning soil, copying text. Medieval skill came from finding rhythm, not speed. They believed that light itself had weight. Bright midday pressed down, low evening light lifted. This was not scientific, but experiential. Light affects hormones, mood, and perception. Medieval days followed light carefully. Medieval myths spoke of returning paths feeling shorter, not because of distance, but familiarity. This was dismissed as imagination. Cognitive mapping confirms this effect. Medieval travel relied on it. They believed that some mistakes corrected themselves if given time. Interference made them worse. Medieval patients avoided unnecessary action. Waiting was a skill. Medieval people thought that tired people heard differently, noticing tone more than words. Evening conversations carried fewer arguments because voices mattered more than content. Modern communication research supports this. There were beliefs that medieval nights softened edges of buildings, thoughts, and fears. Darkness blurred detail. Sharpness faded. This was not fear of night. It was acceptance of softness. They believed that memory loosened its grip during fatigue, allowing forgotten things to surface. This was framed as reflection. Neuroscience confirms reduced inhibition during tiredness. Medieval insight arrived late in the day. Medieval people believed that endurance was quiet. The loud struggles ended early. What remained was steady continuation. This belief shaped how they measured strength. As these observations continue, they no longer feel like additions. They repeat the same truth from different angles, gently, patiently, without urgency. The medieval world does not escalate. It does not climax. It does not conclude. It simply continues like breath, like time measured by bells that ring not to excite, but to reassure that the world is still turning. Nothing new is required. Nothing must be resolved. The mind is free to let go now, to drift without tracking the thought, to rest without following the sentence. History fades into texture. Texture fades into silence. The quiet stretches even further now, unfolding without expectation, without urgency, as if the medieval past itself has slowed to match the pace of sleep. Medieval people believed that small, repeated acts mattered more than sudden, dramatic ones. Lighting a candle at the same hour each evening, tending a fire, stirring a pot, walking a familiar path. These actions were unremarkable, almost invisible. Later generations dismissed them as mundane. Yet through repetition, communities endured. Work, life, and observation became steady rhythms, unnoticed until long after their effects were felt. The ordinary, in medieval life, carried weight. There was a belief that calm observation softened fear. Watching water flow, clouds drift, animals graze. This was framed as devotion or patience. But mindfulness, though unnamed, was present. Medieval eyes, attentive and unhurried, recorded the world with quiet care. They noted storms long before they arrived, tides long before they rose, animal behavior long before it became science. Observation itself was a kind of protection. Medieval myths spoke of silence carrying meaning. Not empty silence, but layered, attentive silence. Monks in cloisters understood it. Farmers after long workdays understood it. The hush that fell over a village after winter storms. The hush in the forest at twilight, these were not just absence of sound, but presence of understanding. Modern science confirms that silence affects cognition, lowers stress, and increases focus. Medieval people experienced it without measurement. They believed that work done slowly outlasted work done quickly. Spinning wool, tending animals, copying manuscripts all endured because attention followed pace, not speed. Modern ergonomics, modern labor studies, and modern craft wisdom echo the same principle. Medieval people had no need to prove it. They lived it. There was a belief that fatigue revealed what mattered most. When the body and mind were tired, trivial distractions fell away. Chroniclers noted clarity arising from exhaustion, patterns emerging when effort was spent. Modern science recognizes decision fatigue, but also the paradoxical insight that sometimes comes when defenses are lowered. Medieval life observed this naturally. Medieval people thought that small failures should be accepted and waited out. Not ignored recklessly, but endured quietly. Attempts that did not succeed were noted, remembered, and then revisited when energy returned. This patience preserved resources, energy, and sanity. Modern problem-solving mirrors the same principle. They believed that certain routines train the body before the mind. prayer, repetitive labor, measured movement, hands and muscles learned before memory and thought. Medieval people did not distinguish physical and mental practice. They flow together. Modern neuroscience calls this procedural memory, but medieval life needed only the effect. There were myths about the night carrying subtle truths. Shadows shifted, temperature changed, sound traveled differently. People noticed. Insights arrived in quiet moments. Dreams reinforced observations. These were not supernatural phenomena, merely lived experiences in a world without electric distraction. Medieval observers believed that endurance was quiet and that true strength did not announce itself. Fatigue, routine, patience all shaped character, subtly, invisibly. Strength was measured not in spectacle, but in the accumulation of small acts sustained across days, months, and years. They believed that sleep itself was a teacher. Dreams repeated lessons, rest recovered observation, and waking slowly prepared the mind for noticing again. Sleep was not an interruption, but a continuation of life's rhythms. Modern understanding of sleep cycles, memory consolidation, and cognitive restoration echoes the same principle. As these observations drift in, they no longer need to be categorized, argued over, or proven. They merge into texture, they merge into rhythm. They merge into the quiet, persistent flow of time itself. The medieval world, seen through patient eyes, is no longer distant or strange. It is gentle. It is deliberate. It is slow. And now, as awareness softens, there is no final thought left to chase. No sentence left to complete. No story left to finish. The night continues to hold everything evenly. History, observation, myth, and truth, all settling together. And sleep, steady and inevitable, flows deeper still until there is no need to continue. No need to observe, no need to speak, and nothing at all remains awake except the quiet, unbroken, endless. The quiet stretches on, almost imperceptibly, folding itself around every thought, every sense, until it feels as though even time has paused to rest. Medieval people believed that stillness was a teacher. Not dramatic, not demanding, but gentle. Watching the sway of trees, the movement of water, the slow progression of seasons, these were lessons recorded in the mind, body, and memory. Later generations called it superstition or boredom, but medieval observers understood the rhythm of life itself. Observation did not need excitement to be meaningful. There was a belief that fatigue clarified what was unimportant. When energy dwindled, the mind released unnecessary concerns. Modern psychology confirms that exhaustion filters distractions, revealing essentials. Medieval chroniclers, though unaware of cognitive science, recorded the same patterns in human behavior. The weary body, the focused mind, the silent understanding that followed. Medieval myths spoke of repetition as invisible guidance. Bells ringing at set hours, prayers repeated, bread baked daily, fields tended in precise rhythms. Each repetition trained not only skill but patience. Modern studies on habit formation echo this principle. Medieval life, unremarkable on the surface, was built on these invisible structures that shaped endurance, awareness, and resilience. They believed that small, steady movements mattered more than sudden bursts of action. Spinning wool slowly, walking deliberately, drawing letters carefully, these actions preserved energy, prevented mistakes, and cultivated attention. Modern ergonomics and craft psychology would later confirm what medieval life practiced instinctively. Medieval people thought that silence carried truth. Not only the absence of sound, but the subtle textures within it. The creak of a floorboard, the sigh of wind through a window, the faint rustle of animals. These were noted, remembered, and respected. Silence was not emptiness. It was information, a guide to perception. There was a belief that patience could shape character. Waiting, enduring small discomforts, observing without interference all cultivated resilience. Modern psychology recognizes delayed gratification as central to emotional regulation. Medieval life, in its quiet rhythms, trained the mind without naming the process. They believed that fatigue could soften fear, exhausted bodies lowered defenses. Tired minds became more receptive. Evening communities were calmer because energy for conflict had drained away. Observers noted that subtle truths emerged more easily when the body slowed. Medieval myths spoke of nights that altered perception. Shadows lengthened, light dimmed, sounds carried differently. People noticed what was invisible during the day. Night sharpened some senses, dulled others. This was not mystical. It was the experience of a body attuned to the natural world. They believed that observation was a form of survival. Noticing subtle changes in weather, in animal behavior, and the land itself, these were critical to daily life. Modern science calls it pattern recognition, threat assessment, environmental awareness. Medieval life called it careful watching. There was a belief that even minor tasks, done faithfully, preserved continuity. Tending animals, sweeping floors, keeping fire, each small act was a thread holding the world together. Neglect them, and disruption followed. Attention to the ordinary ensured the survival of the extraordinary. Medieval people thought that rest was as important as action. Sleep, quiet moments, pauses in labor all restored the capacity to perceive, remember, and act. Modern research on recovery, circadian rhythms, and cognitive function echoes the same principle. Medieval rest was practice, not luxury. As these thoughts drift and settle, they no longer need narrative, argument, or proof. They merge into the atmosphere of stillness itself. History becomes texture, myth becomes rhythm, and observation becomes presence. The medieval world continues quietly, patiently, deliberately, as it always has. And now sleep, inevitable and calm, moves fully through the mind and body, carrying the past, the observations, the myths, and the truths with it, until there is nothing left awake at all, only the unbroken, endless, gentle quiet. Medieval people believed that every small act left a trace. Lighting a lamp, drawing water, tending animals, turning soil, they were minor, almost invisible gestures, yet each contributed to the rhythm of life. Later generations dismissed them as mundane, but medieval observers knew otherwise. Every repeated motion, every careful action accumulated, shaping both the body and the world around it. Endurance lived in the small details. There was a belief that the body remembered more than the mind. Hands, feet, and muscles carried knowledge long after thought had wandered. Scribes' fingers memorized letters, farmers' hands memorized soil, carpenters' muscles memorized rhythm. Modern science calls it procedural memory, but medieval life practiced it intuitively. The body learned, the mind followed. Medieval myths spoke of subtle truths revealed only in slow observation. Watching water flow, clouds drift, animals move, these were lessons without words. They were dismissed later as poetic exaggeration, but perception sharpened in stillness. Patterns emerged. Danger was anticipated. Insight came quietly, when the mind was patient enough to notice. They believed that silence was alive. Not empty, not passive, but full of texture. The creak of a floorboard, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of distant bells each carried information. Silence was a guide, a teacher, a way to understand the world without speech. Modern attention research confirms that quiet enhances perception and memory. Medieval people lived it instinctively. There was a belief that waiting cultivated wisdom. Pause before acting, observe before speaking, endure before judging. This was framed as moral or spiritual guidance, but it was practical. Timing mattered. Patience preserved energy, reduced mistakes, and allowed understanding to deepen. Medieval people thought that fatigue clarified perception. Tired bodies and minds shed unnecessary distractions. Patterns stood out. Truths, subtle and overlooked, became visible. Evening communities were calmer because exhaustion softened pride, argument, and tension. Observation followed naturally when resistance was low. They believed that routine shaped endurance. Daily repetition, prayer, labor, tending animals, turning the soil built resilience. Modern psychology recognizes habit and ritual as stabilizing forces. Medieval life, unremarkable on the surface, achieved this without instruction, measurement, or theory. There were myths of the night carrying its own logic. Shadows lengthened, sounds carried differently, movement felt altered. People noticed what was invisible during the day. Night sharpened some senses while dulling others. It was not mystical. It was lived experience. Medieval observers believed that care in small things preserved balance. Attention to minor details prevented greater chaos. Tending a fire, sweeping a floor, repairing a tool, each minor act reinforced the structure of life. Neglect one, and disorder spread quietly. Modern systems theory mirrors this principle, centuries later. They believed that sleep itself was a teacher. Dreams repeated lessons, rest restored perception, and waking prepared the mind to notice again. Sleep was not interruption, it was continuation. Medieval people knew this without instruments, without study, without proof. As these truths drift and settle, they lose the need for argument or narrative. They blend into rhythm, texture, and quiet. Observation and myth become indistinct. History itself becomes soft and present, not distant. The medieval world continues, patient and gentle, without urgency, without climax, without demand. And sleep, inevitable and unremarkable, moves fully through mind and body, carrying centuries of observation, patience, and small truths with it until there is nothing left awake, only the endless, soft, unbroken quiet. Medieval people believed that patience itself was tangible. Waiting at the well, tending the fields, watching clouds move across the sky, these were not empty pauses. Each act of waiting shaped perception, built endurance, and tuned the senses. Later generations dismissed it as idle time, but medieval life depended on this rhythm. Life itself moved slowly, and understanding grew in that slowness. They believed that small, repeated acts held power greater than dramatic gestures. Lighting a fire, stirring a pot, feeding animals, walking the same path each day, all were subtle contributions to the order of life. Modern science calls this incremental effect, accumulation, or compounding. Medieval life called it necessary survival. Medieval myths spoke of the body remembering what the mind forgot. Fingers, muscles, posture, they retained knowledge that thought could not. Scribes copied letters with practiced hands. Farmers tilled soil with memory in every movement. Modern neuroscience calls this procedural memory. Medieval life simply lived it. There was a belief that silence had layers. Not emptiness, but texture. The rustle of leaves, the faint wind through the timbers. Distant bells, they were information. Awareness sharpened in quiet. Danger was anticipated. Insight emerged when the mind was still enough to notice. Modern attention research confirms the power of silence. Medieval people experienced it naturally. They believed that fatigue clarified perception. When bodies and minds were tired, trivial distractions faded. Patterns appeared. Truths that had been invisible in the day became clear. Evening communities were gentler because exhaustion lowered resistance, softening pride in argument. Observation followed naturally when defenses were low. There was a belief that routine shaped endurance. Daily repetition, prayer, labor, tending animals, spinning wool built resilience. Modern psychology recognizes the stabilizing effects of habit. Medieval life achieved this without names, without theory, without instruction. The rhythm itself was enough. They believed that night altered perception. Shadows lengthened, sound traveled differently, movement felt different. Some senses sharpened, others dulled. Night revealed what the day obscured. It was not mystical, it was experience. Medieval observers thought that care in small things preserved balance. Attention to minor details prevented disorder from spreading. A tended fire, a repaired roof, a cleaned path, each minor act reinforced the order of life. Neglect one, and small imbalances quietly grew into larger disruptions. Modern systems theory would later echo the same principle. They believed that sleep was a teacher. Dreams repeated lessons, rest restored perception, and waking prepared the mind to notice again. Sleep was continuation, not interruption. Medieval people knew this instinctively. As these truths drift, they no longer require narrative or proof. They settle into rhythm, texture, and quiet. Observation, myth, and history blur together. The medieval world continues, patient and deliberate, without urgency, without climax, without demand. And sleep, steady, unremarkable, and inevitable, flows fully through mind and body, carrying centuries of observation, patience, and quiet understanding with it, until nothing remains awake, only endless, soft, unbroken stillness. The night goes on, and stillness endures.